Louisiana, 1865. The plantation owner who turned his own obese daughters into slave breeders. A receipt for 50 pounds of bacon, a household of 3. Then a locked door with scratches around the keyhole, and 2 silent daughters who would not lift their eyes from the floor. I was the union clerk who found the weight log. Subject A, Subject B, weekly gain, caloric intake. But the names were not cattle. They were Ilara and Marie. Their father was cultivating them, feeding them like livestock, preparing them to breed a new generation of slaves with his own blood. This is how their secret finally surfaced, through a gardener's testimony and a note hidden in a hymnal, a prayer scratched from inside the cage. When the army would not act, the community delivered its own verdict. Silas Blackwood was found at the bottom of his own dry well. Was it an accident in the darkness, or justice pulled out by the root? Before we dive in, subscribe to keep these buried truths alive and honor the voices history tried to silence. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. It all began with a receipt, not for ammunition or land, but for food. Union Army Provisional Command, Louisiana, October 1865. The war was over, but the accounting had just begun. Corporal Elias Thorne was tasked with auditing the assets of surrendered estates. A dull job of numbers and names. He sat at a rickety wooden desk in a humid, requisitioned office. Lamplight falling on a stack of papers from the Blackwood Plantation. He isolated one receipt, 50 pounds of cured bacon, 20 sacks of milled corn, 10 pounds of sugarloaf, a week's supply, for a household of 3. Thorne had seen starving men move armies on less. He tapped the paper with his finger, studying the name at the bottom. Silas Blackwood and his 2 daughters. It made no sense. The numbers did not balance. He marked it for a field visit. A week later, Thorne's horse kicked up dust on a long, neglected road to the Blackwood estate. The air was heavy and still, pressing against his skin like a damp cloth. The house was large but decaying, its white columns stained with mildew, shutters drawn tight against the sun. As he approached, he noticed the gardens were overgrown, strangled with weeds. No slaves worked the fields anymore. No laborers tended the grounds. The silence of the place was wrong. Not peaceful. It was a heavy, watched silence, the kind that makes a man check over his shoulder without knowing why. Silas Blackwood opened the door before Thorne could knock. He was tall and gaunt, his face all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. He wore a dark suit, worn but clean, pressed with care. His smile was practiced, polite, utterly without warmth. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter fog. He invited Thorne inside with a sweep of his hand, his voice smooth and cultured, a gentleman by all appearances. But Thorne had learned during the war that the most dangerous men often wore the finest manners. The air inside was thick with the smell of boiled greens and old furniture polish. The parlor was dim, curtains drawn, a single oil lamp casting long shadows across faded wallpaper. 2 young women sat on a settee against the far wall. They were large, their bodies swollen beneath layers of dark fabric, their faces pale and expressionless. Ilara and Marie, 19 and 17 years old, Blackwood said, introducing them with the same casual tone a man might use to point out furniture. The daughters did not look up. Their hands were folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on the floor. They did not speak. They did not move. It was as if they were not truly there at all, just shapes in the dim light. Silas offered Thorne a glass of water, discussing his meager estate with practiced ease. The plantation had fallen on hard times, he explained. The loss of labor, the chaos of occupation, the collapse of the old economy. He spoke in measured tones, each word chosen with care, his hands gesturing gently as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Behind him, Thorne noticed a door set into the wall. It had no handle, only a keyhole, scratched and worn, as if something had clawed at it repeatedly. Blackwood followed his gaze and smiled that empty smile again. He called it the study, said he had lost the key years ago. But Thorne saw the glint of a heavy bolt on Blackwood's side of the door. It was not a room meant to keep people out. It was a room meant to keep something in. Thorne asked his questions, counted the rooms, noted the provisions. Blackwood answered everything with that same smooth courtesy, never hesitating, never stumbling. But the daughters remained silent throughout, their breathing shallow, their bodies unnaturally still. When Thorne rose to leave, neither girl looked up. Blackwood walked him to the door, shaking his hand with a firm grip, thanking him for his service to the Union. As Thorne mounted his horse, he glanced back at the house. One of the upstairs windows showed a pale face pressed against the glass, watching. Then the curtain fell and the face disappeared. Thorne left that day with the numbers from the receipt churning in his mind. 50 pounds of bacon, 20 sacks of corn, 10 pounds of sugar. For 3 people. The food, the silent daughters, the locked door, the scratches around the keyhole, the bolt on the wrong side. As he rode back toward town, the pieces began to arrange themselves in his head, forming a pattern he did not want to see. The Blackwood plantation was not just a home. It was a cage. And somewhere in those meticulous records, in those carefully kept accounts, was the key to understanding what Silas Blackwood was truly doing behind those bolted doors. Thorne was a man who believed in balanced books, and these numbers, he knew, would not balance until he understood the truth of what they measured. Thorne could not shake the feeling of that house, the image of those silent daughters, their pale faces and empty eyes, haunted his sleep. The scratches around that keyhole, the bolt on the wrong side of the door. Using his authority as an auditor, he requisitioned all of Silas Blackwood's accessible records. They arrived 3 days later in a single dusty crate, delivered by a private carrier who seemed eager to be rid of it. Thorne pried open the lid with a crowbar. Inside were no cotton yields, no bills of sale for land, no correspondence with factors or merchants, just journals, leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked with age and use, filled with page after page of meticulous handwriting. He was back at his desk late that night, the office empty, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the scratch of his pen as he took notes. He opened the first leather-bound logbook. The title, written in neat cursive across the inside cover, read, Household Husbandry. The pages were filled with dates and numbers, arranged in neat columns, each entry precise and methodical. At first, he thought it was a log for livestock. Farmers kept such records: weight gain, feed consumption, breeding schedules. But as his eyes moved down the columns, his stomach tightened. Subject high, morning weight. Subject B, morning weight. Weekly gain, caloric intake. The names were not for cattle. They were Alera and Marie. He turned the pages slowly, each entry deepening the dread that had begun to settle in his chest like cold water. March 12th. Ilara, 198 pounds. Resisted third portion. Administered tonic. April 3rd. Marie, 211 pounds. Lethargic. Excellent. May 20th. Both subjects approaching optimal mass for breeding viability. The stock must be strong to endure. The words were cold, scientific, clinical, as if Blackwood were documenting an agricultural experiment, not describing his own daughters. Thorne felt his hands begin to shake. He set the journal down and stood, pacing the small office, trying to steady his breathing. He returned to the desk and opened a second journal, this one titled Apothecary Accounts. Receipt after receipt for laudanum, for chloral hydrate, for extract of valerian root, calming tonics, the receipts called them, sedatives, drugs to keep someone docile, compliant, too dulled to resist. The quantities were staggering, enough to keep two young women in a perpetual fog, their wills dissolved, their bodies malleable. Thorne calculated the doses in his head. These were not medications for illness, they were tools of control. A third journal bore no title at all. Inside, the handwriting changed. It became tighter, more fervent, the pen pressing hard enough into the paper that some words tore through. Blackwood wrote of bloodlines, of purity, of strength. He wrote of the fall of the Confederacy as a temporary setback, a test that had revealed the weakness of lesser men. He wrote of his vision for a new order, one built not on politics or armies, but on biology. Strong blood, he wrote, controlled breeding, a master race cultivated with the same care a man applies to horses or hounds. The old South is dead, but its superior stock remains. I will not let it vanish. I will rebuild it, one generation at a time, with my own hands and my own seed. Thorne felt bile rise in his throat. He forced himself to keep reading. Blackwood detailed his plan with the precision of an engineer. His daughters would serve as the vessels. They were of his blood, he wrote, pure and untainted. He had spent years preparing them, fattening them, ensuring their bodies could bear strong children. He had already selected the men from among the former field hands, freedmen who did not yet understand they were still being measured and assessed. Men with broad shoulders, men with strong backs. He would bring them to the study, he wrote, to evaluate them, to choose the best stock. The breeding would begin in spring. The first crop, he called it, would arrive by winter. Thorne closed the journal and sat in the darkness, the lamplight casting his shadow long across the wall. The receipts for food now made a sickening sense. Blackwood was not feeding his daughters. He was cultivating them, preparing them like livestock for a purpose so monstrous that even the war, with all its horrors, had not prepared Thorne for it. This was a systematic program. A father turning his own children into breeding stock, using drugs to keep them compliant, using isolation to keep them silent, planning to use other men, men who believed they were free, as unwitting participants in his grotesque experiment. The dread Thorne had felt at the plantation was no longer just a feeling. It was a fact, written in ink, documented in ledgers, as real and undeniable as the numbers in a balance sheet. He spent the rest of the night reading, his eyes burning, his mind reeling. By dawn, he had mapped the entire plan. He knew the timeline, he knew the methods, he knew the victims. The ledgers were damning. They were a confession written in Blackwood's own hand, but they were also a father's private madness, kept behind locked doors, hidden from the world. Thorne needed more than ink on paper. He needed a human voice. He needed someone who had seen Silas Blackwood's true nature and survived to tell of it. Thorne found the name in one of Blackwood's older journals, a notation from years before the war. Jedediah, gardener and groundskeeper, paid quarterly in coin. The entry was crossed out with a single line, dated April 1865, the month the war ended. No explanation. Just a line through the name, as if the man had ceased to exist. Thorne made inquiries in town. A freedmen's settlement had formed 3 miles west of the Blackwood estate. a cluster of small cabins on land that had once been fallow cotton fields. An old woman selling eggs at the market told him where to find Jedediah. She said it quietly, looking over her shoulder, as if the name itself carried weight. Thorn rode out on a gray afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of rain. The settlement was quiet, smoke rising from chimneys, children playing in the dirt yards between cabins. He found Jedediah on the porch of a small wooden structure, mending a harness with gnarled, weathered hands. He was in his 70s, his hair white as cotton, his face lined deep with the years. When Thorn dismounted and introduced himself, Jedediah did not look up. He kept working the leather, his fingers moving with practiced precision. His eyes scanned the horizon, watching the road, watching the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Thorn explained why he had come. He spoke of the ledgers, the weight logs, the receipts for tonics. He did not soften the words. Jedediah's hands stilled. He set the harness aside and finally looked at Thorn, his gaze steady and unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he gestured to a wooden chair beside him. Thorn sat. The old man began to speak in a low, steady voice, his words measured and deliberate, as if each one cost him something to say. He told his story without embellishment. He had worked the Blackwood estate for 40 years, he said. Knew every tree, every path, every stone. He had tended the gardens when Hilara and Mary were children, when they still ran through the rows of roses and laughed in the summer sun. He remembered when their mother died, birthing a son who lived only 3 days. He remembered how Silas Blackwood changed after that, how something in him hardened, turned inward, became cold and calculating. The girls stopped going to church, stopped visiting town, stopped walking the grounds. They were kept inside, Jedediah said, their world shrinking year by year, until it was just a house, just a parlor, just the rooms their father allowed them to occupy. Then came the day the news of Lee's surrender reached the plantation. April 9th, 1865. Jedediah was in the garden when he heard Blackwood call his name. He went to the study, a room he had never been permitted to enter. Blackwood was seated at his desk, surrounded by open journals, his face eerily calm. He looked at Jedediah for a long time, studying him the way a man studies an animal at auction. Then he spoke. He said the world of weak men was over. He said the South would rise again, not with armies, but with blood. Strong blood. He looked at Jedediah's hands, his shoulders, his frame. He said he would need sturdy seed for his new garden. Those were his exact words, sturdy seed. Jedediah understood what Blackwood meant. He understood that the man was no longer speaking of flowers or vegetables. He was speaking of people, of bodies, of a plan so monstrous that even a man who had lived his entire life under the boot of slavery could not fathom it. Jedediah left that night. He took nothing but the clothes on his back and walked until the Blackwood house was a shadow behind him. He never went back, but he could not forget. He spoke of the girls, of how they had changed in those final years before he fled, how they used to walk the grounds with purpose, with life in their eyes. Then, how they were forbidden to leave the house, how their dresses grew larger, their bodies swelling beneath the fabric, how the sounds of their weeping at night, which had once carried across the still air, were replaced by a drugged, heavy silence. He had seen the apothecary's boy deliver parcels to the house. He had seen Blackwood measure portions of food with the same care a chemist measures compounds. He had watched the girls become shadows, their wills erased, their bodies reshaped for a purpose they could not resist or escape. Thorn listened without interrupting. When Jedediah finished, the old man looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He asked Thorn what the Union intended to do. Thorn hesitated. He did not know. He had the ledgers. He had the receipts. Now he had a witness, but he did not know if it would be enough. Jedediah nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. He said he had learned long ago that the law was a thing made by men, and men chose when to apply it and when to look away. He said some evils were too deep for laws to reach. Some monsters lived in places the law would never go. Thorn thanked him and stood to leave. As he mounted his horse, Jedediah called out to him. He said one more thing. He said the girls were still alive, still in that house, still under their father's control. And winter was coming. Armed with the ledgers and Jedediah's testimony, Thorn went to his superior, Captain Nathaniel Hayes. Hayes was a career soldier, a man who had survived 3 years of war by following orders and avoiding complications. He had seen enough of the South's ugliness to be weary of it, enough death to want nothing more than to finish his tour and go home to Massachusetts. His office was sparse, a desk and 2 chairs in a requisition room that still smelled of tobacco and old wood. When Thorn entered, Hayes was pouring whiskey into a glass, the amber liquid catching the afternoon light. Thorn laid out his findings methodically. He presented the receipt for provisions. He opened the Household Husbandry Journal and read aloud the entries documenting the systematic fattening of Elara and Marie Blackwood. He showed the apothecary accounts, the quantities of laudanum and chloral hydrate, the sedatives used to keep the daughters compliant. He described Jedediah's testimony, the plan Silas Blackwood had revealed, the intent to breed a new generation using his own daughters as vessels and freedmen as unwitting participants. He spoke clearly, without emotion, presenting the facts as he would present any audit. The numbers, the dates, the pattern. Hayes listened, swirling the whiskey in his glass, his face unreadable. When Thorn finished, Hayes set the glass down and leaned back in his chair. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then he spoke. He said the war was over. He said the Union's job was to maintain order, not to adjudicate every moral failing in the conquered South. He said Silas Blackwood was feeding his daughters, that it was eccentric, perhaps even disturbing, but it was not a federal crime. He said they were an occupying army, not the conscience of Louisiana. He said the daughters were adults, not prisoners, and if they wished to leave, they were free to do so. He said Thorn's job was to audit estates, not to investigate domestic arrangements. He said the matter was closed. Then he looked directly at Thorn and gave him an order. Drop this. File the report as routine. Move on to the next estate. That is an order, Corporal. Thorn left the office with the ledgers under his arm, his jaw tight, his mind reeling. He had laid out a case for monstrous evil, a father's plan to turn his own children into breeding stock, and he had been told to file it away and forget it. The law, it seemed, had a limit, and Silas Blackwood lived just beyond it. That night, Thorn sat in his quarters, staring at the journals, knowing what they contained, knowing what they meant, and knowing he had been ordered to do nothing. He thought of those silent daughters, their empty eyes, their drugged compliance. He thought of Jedediah's words, "Some evils are too deep for laws to reach." Word traveled fast in occupied Louisiana. Within days, news of Thorn's inquiry reached Silas Blackwood. How it reached him, Thorn never learned. Perhaps a sympathetic clerk. Perhaps a warning from someone who believed the old order deserved protection. It did not matter. What mattered was that Blackwood knew, and he acted. A local farmer reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney of the Blackwood house late one night in November. Thick black smoke that poured into the cold air, even though the weather was mild. Thorne knew what that smoke meant. The household husbandry journal, the notes on bloodlines and breeding schedules, the written confessions of intent. The most direct evidence was turning to ash, fed into the fire page by page, the ink curling and blackening, the words disappearing into smoke. Thorne rode out to the plantation the next morning, but he was too late. Blackwood met him at the door with that same empty smile, that same cold courtesy. He invited Thorne inside. He offered tea. When Thorne asked about the smoke, Blackwood said he had been burning old correspondence, cleaning out the study, making room for the future. He said it with such calm assurance that Thorne felt a chill run down his spine. The man was untouchable. He knew it. He stood in his decaying house, surrounded by the evidence of his monstrous plan. And he knew that no law would reach him, no authority would stop him. The daughters sat in the parlor, silent as ever, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on nothing. Winter was coming. The Union Army was pulling back, consolidating its forces, preparing to leave Louisiana to govern itself. Captain Hayes had made it clear that Thorne's investigation was over. The official channels were closed. The evidence had been destroyed. Silence was descending again. The same heavy, watched silence that had settled over the Blackwood estate for years. The truth was known, but it was locked away, behind the captain's indifference, and Blackwood's bolted door, and the legal fiction that a man could do as he wished within his own home. Thorne had followed every proper procedure. He had documented the facts. He had presented the case, and he had been told to let it go. The moral test was clear. Would he obey his orders and let the evil fester in the dark? Or would he find another way, a way outside the law, to stop a predator the law would not touch? The official channels were closed. Thorne was ordered to archive the Blackwood file and move on. He spent 3 days processing routine audits, his mind elsewhere, the weight of what he knew pressing against his chest like a stone. Captain Hayes had made his position clear. The army would not act. The law would not intervene. Silas Blackwood would continue his monstrous plan, and 2 young women would remain trapped in that decaying house, drugged into compliance, their bodies prepared for a purpose too horrific to speak aloud. Thorne sat one last night in his office, the case a cold weight in his gut, the lamplight casting long shadows across the walls. He had done everything by the book, and the book had failed. Just then, a quiet knock at the door. Thorne looked up. It was Jedediah. The old man stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, his face drawn with something that looked like duty. He said he had been thinking. He said there was something Thorne should see. He held out a small, worn hymnal, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages yellowed and soft. He explained that Alara's mother had given it to him years ago, before she died. She had asked him to hold it for her daughter, to give it to Alara when the time was right. But there had never been a right time. The girl had been locked away, unreachable. Jedediah had kept the hymnal all these years, waiting. He felt now that he should pass it on, even if it could not reach Alara's hands. He gave it to Thorne and left without another word. Thorne sat alone with the hymnal. He opened it slowly, running his fingers over the pages. Psalms and prayers. The words faded but still legible. He flipped through it idly, not sure what he was looking for, not sure why Jedediah had thought it important. Then, between the pages near the back, a small piece of paper fell out and fluttered to the desk. It was folded tight, the creases sharp, as if it had been hidden with great care. Thorn unfolded it. The handwriting was faint, almost a scratch, written in pencil that had smudged in places. The hand that wrote it had been shaking. It was from Elara. The note was short. Father calls it a duty, says we are vessels. The tonics make the days dream away. He has chosen the men, from the field hands. He brings them to the study to look at them. He measures them. The door is bolted, but I hear, God have mercy. We are the crop. Thorn read it twice, then a third time. This was not a ledger entry. This was not a clinical observation. This was a prayer from inside the cage. It was the voice Silas Blackwood had tried to silence, the humanity he had tried to erase. It was the final piece. The law had failed. The army had failed. But conscience had not. Thorn did not file the note. He did not take it to Captain Hayes. The next morning, he rode out, not to the army barracks, but to the freedmen's settlement where Jedediah lived. He brought the provisioning receipts. He brought his memory of the weight log. He brought Elara's note. He did not give an order. He did not make a demand. He simply bore witness. He sat with the council of elders, men who had survived slavery, men who understood the nature of predators like Blackwood, men who knew that some evils required a different kind of justice. He laid the facts out on a wooden table under an open sky. He read Elara's words aloud. Then he stood, mounted his horse, and rode away. He did not ask what they would do. He did not need to. A week later, a report crossed Captain Hayes's desk. Silas Blackwood had been found at the bottom of his own dry well. The official finding was accidental death. The man had been walking the property at night, the report said, and had fallen. No witnesses, no signs of struggle. The community claimed they saw nothing. Hayes read the report, signed it without comment, and filed it away. If he suspected the truth, he gave no indication. The matter was closed. That winter, a fire of unknown origin claimed the Blackwood house. It burned through the night, the flames visible for miles, consuming the decaying structure down to the foundation. By morning, nothing remained but blackened timbers and cold Louisiana soil. The locked study, the bolted door, the rooms where two daughters had been kept as livestock. All of it turned to ash. As for Elara and Marie, they were taken in by Jedediah's family. Their names appeared one last time in the public record, in the town registry, listed simply as survivors. No details, no explanation, just that single word. Moral order was restored, not by a government, not by a law, but by the quiet integrity of a community that refused to let a monster live among them. Thorn returned to his audits. He never spoke of the Blackwood case again. He completed his service in Louisiana and returned to Ohio, where he lived a long and unremarkable life. But he kept Elara's note. He folded it carefully and placed it in his Bible, where it remained until his death. A reminder that some truths cannot be filed away, some evils cannot be tolerated, and some justice is delivered not by judges or soldiers, but by those who simply refuse to look away. The land, it seems, always remembers, and the people who tend it remember even longer.